For today, we are going to talk about learning and the specific processes under certain theories that explain how we learn and how we remember what we learn. So first and foremost, let us define what learning is. So learning is an enduring change in behavior that occurs with experience. So the basic premise here is that when you gain experience, you also learn. Okay, there are also changes in your behavior. So in other words, this perspective is endorsing the view that the environment will help us shape our behavior because there are a lot of experiences that comes from the environment, such as being shaped by our parents, being taught how to pronounce words by our teachers, etc. Okay, so between nature and nurture debate of personality, learning in somehow integrates nature with nurture, but it's more of the nurture side or the effect of the environment in shaping our personality and behavior. So learning and memory work hand in hand. So it would be very difficult for you if you just learn but you will not be able to retain this learning, okay? Or you easily forget what you have learned. That will be very difficult. Okay, so learning occurs when information moves from short-term to long-term memory, or when information gets consolidated, it is permanently or it is stored in a long-term storage, which is our long-term memory. Alright, so one of the basic processes under learning is what we call association. It is a process by which two pieces of information from the environment are repeatedly linked so that we begin to connect them in our minds. So here are some things that we associate from our day-to-day lives, such as we link bells with lunch breaks. Phobics associate stimulus with fear. Okay, because in the first place, for example, let's say fear of elevators. Elevators will not be enough to make you afraid. But the experience of something, but the bad experience that you had in an elevator is enough to make you afraid of elevators. That's how you associate fear with the stimulus. Okay, that's why not everyone are afraid of elevators or of dogs and other things. People with social anxiety associate public speaking with criticism. So we know that people with social anxiety disorder are afraid or they are anxious of criticisms. Okay? They try to anticipate situations wherein they might be criticized. So that explains why they do their best to avoid situations wherein they have to speak in public. While other people without social anxiety are more comfortable with public speaking. Perhaps it's because their learning is more of the positive side or the positive effects of public speaking. Say, for example, normal individuals feel success when they speak in public, while those with social anxiety have felt failure or being criticized when speaking in public. So associations form simply as a result of two events occurring together, whether or not the relationship between them makes any sense. That's why among people with phobia, some of them actually recognize that their fear is irrational, or they know that they should not really be afraid of that object, but still they are afraid. Okay? That's why they need to undergo what we call intervention or therapy so that their associations can be modified so that their learning can be changed. They will no longer associate fear with the object. Okay, so that will be one example of association and how this association affects our learning. So basically, association is the basic process behind the theory of conditioning because conditioning is a form of associative learning in which behaviors are triggered by associations with events in the environment. Say, for example, you know that you have been conditioned when you're afraid of snakes even though the zookeeper says that it won't hurt you. Or You think that people with social anxiety think that they are afraid of being criticized, although no one would actually criticize them in that situation. Now, in this lesson, we are going to talk about two types of conditioning, which are classical and operant. First, let's talk about classical conditioning. So classical conditioning came from this is the theory of Ivan Pavlov, wherein it's a form of associative learning in which a neutral stimulus becomes associated with a stimulus to which one has an automatic or inborn response. So in other words, a neutral stimulus was paired with an unconditioned stimulus. Okay, so this happened because Pavlov noticed that dogs began to salivate even before the meat powder was presented. It was as if the sounds of the technician preparing the apparatus signaled to the dogs that meat powder was about to come. Okay, so they're only supposed to salivate once they see the meat powder, once they notice its presence, once they smell it. However, when the technician in charge of the experiment prepares the apparatus, it emits some kind of sound, and that sound was enough to signal to these dogs that the meat powder is coming. Hence, even in the absence of meat powder, and the dogs were salivating the moment they hear the sound from the apparatus. So most of us would believe that the sound presented to these dogs were the sound of a bell, but some accounts would say that it's not really a bell but more of a buzzer. But anyway, still that won't change the fact that classical conditioning happened in this experiment. So in Pavlov's experiment, he was working with various dogs. He rang a bell just before showing them the meat powder. The bell itself should not elicit any response because it does not mean anything to the dog. Okay, you do not have an inborn response to a bell. Therefore, in this situation, the bell is the neutral stimulus. Okay, they should only respond to the meat, okay, through salivation, because meat, since it's food, it will elicit a naturally occurring response called salivation, meaning the meat is the unconditioned stimulus, while salivation is the unconditioned response. Okay? While the bell is the neutral stimulus. Okay? However, even the presentation of the bell alone elicits the salivation. Here are some important terms to remember in classical conditioning. First, we have what we call unconditioned stimulus, which are environmental inputs that produces the same unlearned involuntary response. And the list of unconditioned stimuli include things such as food, water, sex, and even physical comfort. We do not need to be taught how we should respond to these things, but rather our responses are innate, or it's inborn. Okay? Say for example, we know that with these four things, they all they all elicit the feelings of pleasure or some feelings of happiness from the individual. Okay, now these feelings of pleasure or happiness towards food, water, physical comfort, and other natural stimuli are what we call unconditioned response. Okay, the unconditioned response is the natural, automatic, inborn, and involuntary reactions to a stimulus. Next, when we are trying to classically condition someone, we want to introduce a neutral stimulus or an object or situation that when presented alone does not lead to an automatic or unconditioned response. Okay? Say for example, an unconditioned stimulus can be pain. The unconditioned response would be discomfort through shouting or saying that you're in pain or crying. The neutral stimulus can be the sound of a buzzer. Okay, now what will happen if we associate or we pair together pain with the sound of a buzzer? Okay, then eventually you will be afraid of the sound of the buzzer, right? So from being neutral stimulus, if we are now reacting to the neutral stimulus, it is transformed into what we call conditioned stimulus. Okay, or a previously neutral input that an organism learns to associate with the UCS. Okay, so previously the buzzer was a neutral stimulus. Then eventually, when we show that we are having feelings of discomfort with the sounds of the buzzer, it is it has become an unconditioned stimulus. Now, in that case, the pain will also become a conditioned response because that is your response to the conditioned stimulus. Now, the next illustration may be more helpful in understanding these five terms. Okay, so let's go back to this example for us to learn the five terms in classical conditioning. So, the unconditioned stimulus will be the meat. It would be enough to produce or elicit salivation, which is the natural response towards food. Okay, so that's why the meat is labeled as unconditioned stimulus, while salivation is the unconditioned response. The bell is considered a neutral stimulus because it should produce no response. That's why neutral stimulus at first will not produce any response. Then eventually, in classical conditioning, you pair the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. It will produce the same response of salivation. Okay? Now, how can we make the neutral stimulus? How can we transform it into conditioned stimulus? It will become the conditioned stimulus if it results to salivation even in the absence of meat. This time, we will call salivation not as UCR anymore, but rather we can call it conditioned response. But take note, the UCR and the CR are basically the same response, only that we call it conditioned response when you are now demonstrating that response to a previously neutral stimulus, which is now known as conditioned stimulus. So how should we know that classical conditioning was effective? It is effective if, even in the absence of meat, the bell was sufficient to produce the original feelings of salivation. That's why the response was consistent all throughout the classical conditioning process. It was only absent when the bell was first presented because it was not yet paired with the meat. Okay, so that's a successful classical conditioning. So here's the summary of how classical conditioning works. So multiple pairings of the UCS and the neutral stimulus, which will eventually become the CS, are usually necessary for an association to occur and for the CS to produce the conditioned response. So it will take more than one pairing. It takes time for you to learn that for an organism to elicit the same response towards a neutral stimulus. And the UCS and CS must be paired or presented very close together in time in order for an association to form. So you cannot present food and the bell with a 1 hour or 10-hour interval because that will not work. How are you supposed to pair those two stimuli, right? So the summary of classical conditioning is that what do we pair? The UCS and the CS. Here are other terms in classical conditioning that I want you to remember. First, here we have what we call stimulus generalization. Stimulus generalization happens basically if you tend to respond in the same way to different stimuli. Okay, it's the extension of the association of UCS and CS to include a broad array of stimuli. So say for example, you have taught a certain dog to salivate in the sound of the bell in the laboratory. What if the dog still salivates in the sound of the fire alarm? What if there's a vendor outside the school who rang his bell and the dog still salivate? It means that stimulus generalization happened. Okay? That's why you can see some children or babies saying that someone is calling in the phone, even though the sound is actually coming from the TV, not from the actual telephone. Okay? Now, what is stimulus discrimination? That is the restriction of CR, such as salivation, to only exact CS to which it was conditioned. So that is the opposite of generalization. It's important to teach discrimination more than generalization, so that the person or the organism will know when he or she will have to respond. Okay, so you don't want your dog, let's say, to respond to the call or to the commands by another owner. You don't want the dog to be attracted by someone else. You only want your dog to be attracted by your commands or to follow your commands. That's stimulus discrimination. Okay? Next is extinction. If, say for example, the dog learned to salivate to the sound of the bell because it has been paired with the meat powder, then what if you have been presenting the bell for, let's say, 1 month, but you are not presenting the meat powder? Do you expect that this response will continue to occur in the future? Of course, there will be a reduction in the responses, right? Because the dog will recognize that the sound of the bell does not always mean that he or she is going to be fed. Okay, so extinction happens. So basically, that's in layman's term, that's like decay of learning when your behavior is no longer being um, paired with the original stimulus. Therefore, you realize that there's no need to respond in the same way. Okay. Next, spontaneous recovery happens when, say for example, the dog has already forgotten that he or she will salivate in the presence of the sound of the bell. What if you suddenly pair the bell once again with the meat powder? Then spontaneous recovery would happen, or the dog would be able to recall that the bell or the sound of the bell is is a signal that he or she is going to be fed. Okay, so it would be easier for the dog to learn this time because it happened in the past. Okay, so let's talk about the conditioning of little Albert. So in the case of little Albert, he wasn't really afraid of white rats or animals, but in the experiment of Watson and Rayner 1920, they paired the presence of the white rat, which is neutral, to a loud sound of a hammer striking a steel bar. Okay, so naturally the loud sound will startle Albert. Okay, and the startle is the unconditioned response. Now, what happened is that whenever Albert will see the image or will see the actual white rat, there will be a loud sound. So we can expect that the mere presence of the rat, even without the loud sound, will be enough to elicit startle response. So that really happened to Albert. So basically, what Albert exhibited in the future is that he was afraid of white rats, even in the absence of the loud sound. Okay, so that's how we can say that the repeated pairings of the UCS and the neutral stimulus was successful. Okay, actually, in this experiment, not only that the classical conditioning was successful, stimulus generalization happened as well, because there are some accounts saying that after the experiment, Albert was not only afraid of white rats, he also became afraid of fluffy animals. Okay, so in other words, he generalized the fear to a number of animals, even if they were not present in the experiment, because of one learning experience. That shows us why people with phobia might be afraid of similar things. Okay? That's why we can assume that maybe if someone has social anxiety disorder, if he or she is afraid of public speaking, maybe he or she will also be afraid of delivering an online seminar or talking online with a group of people, because that is a similar situation. Okay, so that's why people with phobia try to avoid not only the feared stimulus, but other similar stimuli as well, which will remind them of their feared stimulus. Now, let's talk about the other type of conditioning, which is operant conditioning. So, it was inspired by Thorndike's law of effect, which states that the consequences of a behavior increase or decrease the likelihood that the behavior will be repeated in future instances. So, in other words, if a behavior is rewarded, then it is encouraged to be repeated again in the future. But if it is punished or not rewarded, then perhaps it will decrease the likelihood that the behavior will be exhibited again in the future. So that was basically extended by Skinner in his theory of operant conditioning, which believes that the process of changing behavior by manipulating the consequences will influence its likelihood to occur again in the future. Say, for example, if texting has proven to be rewarding, then you are more likely to text again in class. If you check social media and you receive a like in your post, then you're more likely to check social media. If you drink coffee one morning, then you feel more awake and that is what you want, then you're more likely to drink coffee again in the future. So these are some just of the basic examples. Okay, so here are some important terms in operant conditioning. First, what is a reinforcer? A reinforcer can be internal or external event that increases the frequency of a behavior. Okay, so there are two subdivisions of reinforcers. It can be primary or secondary. A primary reinforcer is basically like what we talked about earlier in the unconditioned stimulus, but this time let's talk about it in the context of operant conditioning. A primary reinforcer is innate. It is unlearned reinforcers that satisfy our biological needs. Say, for example, food, water, sex, physical comfort, etc. Basically, our basic needs. Okay? On the other hand, a secondary or a conditioned reinforcer are reinforcers that are learned by association, usually via classical conditioning. So say for example, money is not really a reinforcer at first, but you realize that it is a reinforcer because money allows you to buy food. Okay, and so many other basic needs. Grades, with good grades, you can be rewarded, let's say with the food that you like. Okay, if you get approval from your peer or your parents, then you will be taken care of, then you will receive your basic needs. Okay, so secondary reinforcers are not really rewarding at first, but we learn that they are rewarding because secondary reinforcers have been paired with primary reinforcers. Reinforcement can also be classified into two, positive or negative reinforcement. And here are the differences between the two. So in positive reinforcement, this is the presentation or the addition of a stimulus after a behavior occurs that increases how often that behavior will occur in the future. So the keywords here are presentation and addition. On the other hand, negative reinforcement is the removal of a stimulus after a behavior to increase the frequency of that behavior. So the key word in negative reinforcement is removal, or you're trying to remove something that is disliked by the individual so the good behavior will continue. Okay, now here are the specific examples. For example, in positive reinforcement, a good performance in school can be rewarded with good grades or with a star in kindergarten or with applause from your classmates. So those are the reinforcements that we get from the environment or the addition of something for you to continue doing the behavior. Okay? For negative reinforcement, one example of this can be prisoners who are doing well or behaving well in prison. Their life sentence will be their sentence or years that they will spend in jail can be reduced. So that somehow reinforces the good behavior or positive behavior that they are showing. You are removing something that they do not like. Okay, so later let's have more examples of these two. The similarity between the two is that both of them, when you say that it is a reinforcement, both of them increases the likelihood that a behavior will occur again in the future. The difference is that in positive reinforcement, you are presenting something, while in negative reinforcement, you are removing what the person dislikes. Okay? On the other hand, a punishment is a stimulus that decreases the frequency of a behavior. Okay, now let's see this. So there are two types of punishment, positive and negative. When we say positive punishment, there is an addition of a stimulus that decreases behavior. Say, for example, in experiment, a positive punishment can be an electric shock, physical pain, etc. Or deductions in grades, all right, or repercussions for bad behavior. On the other hand, in negative punishment, you are removing something that is being enjoyed by the person so that his bad behavior will be punished. Say, for example, if a child continues to misbehave, then there will be a reduction in screen time, or his toys may be confiscated. You are removing something from him that he likes. That's why his bad behavior gets punished. So which is more effective, punishment or reinforcement? Skinner gave emphasis on this one on this theory by saying that he believes that reinforcement is more effective than punishment. Because in reinforcement, you are telling to someone that he or she should keep doing something because it's a good behavior. While in punishment, you are just reducing the bad behavior, but it will not work that well if you are not clarifying what should be done. So after punishment, there should be correction of behavior. And sometimes punishment can leave some negative outcomes. Okay, it may result to negative outcomes. For example, a child may dislike learning because of punishment. Okay, and it will have some long-term effects. Okay, and one more thing is that punishment should be immediate. It should not be delayed. Because if you delay a punishment, for example, an employee was fired 1 year after the incident, then there's a possibility that that employee will think that he or she was not fired because of the incident because it took so long, but rather he or she might think that his other behaviors were the reason why he was fired. Okay, so you are punishing the wrong behavior. That's why punishment should be immediate. Here is a good summary table that gives us more example of reinforcement and punishment. So for positive reinforcement, you exercise a few times and feel better. Okay, so feeling better, something is being added. Okay, so what happens is that you exercise more often in the future because it adds the feeling of happiness. While in negative reinforcement, if you are using a car that has an annoying buzzer when you're not wearing the seatbelt, then what will you do? You will wear the seatbelt. By wearing the seatbelt, the annoying sound of the buzzer will disappear. Okay, that's why next time what you're going to do to remove that annoying buzzer is to keep on wearing your seatbelt. Okay, so the removal of the stimulus that you do not like increases the likelihood that you will wear your seatbelt. Now let's talk about punishment. So first, in positive punishment, what if you park in a space that is reserved for the faculty? then you will receive a fine for your behavior. And the fine for your behavior, it's a punishment that is being added. So next time you will no longer park in that place. Okay? Unlike a negative punishment, something that you like has been taken away from you. You talk back to your mom, she takes away TV and videos for a week. So what's the result? You stop talking back to your mom so that the things that you enjoy will not be taken away from you. At this point, we are now ready to look at the differences between operant and classical conditioning. I have already discussed to you the examples about the seat belt and the child who was not allowed to watch TV. Now let's take a look at the example of classical conditioning, which is the one on the left. So look at this. Manuel is bullied at the mall. Okay? And then you know that bullying will elicit the experiences of fear and heart racing. Now, he then experiences fear whenever he approaches the mall because it's not the mall that makes you feel anxious or afraid at first. It was bullying. But since you associated bullying with the mall, now you are ready, now you are less likely to go to the mall in the future. That also works with other kinds of events like, say for example, embarrassment or humiliation in a certain place. So the difference is that in classical conditioning, the organism learns about the relationships between stimuli, while in operant conditioning, the organism learns from the consequences of their behavior. Now, let's go back to operant conditioning and let's learn about the schedules of reinforcement. So, when we say schedules of reinforcements, these are patterns of intermittent reinforcement distinguished by whether reinforcement occurs after a set number of responses or after a certain amount of time. Okay, so we will have certain examples for this. Now, there are two major categories: continuous and intermittent. When we say continuous, every time that you do the behavior, there's always a reward. That's why you keep on doing it. Okay? On the other hand, when we say intermittent, you are not sure when you're going to get the reward in the times that you have performed the behavior. Okay? There's a reward, of course, but not after every response. Say for example, going online in Facebook, it doesn't assure you that you will receive a new like or message, but you keep on doing it believing that in the future you will receive the notifications that you like. Okay, so let's look at the actual examples here. Now here are the different kinds of schedules of reinforcement. Take note, all of them are under intermittent. Okay, now let's look at fixed ratio. Fixed ratio is the most similar to continuous. Remember, in continuous, you get rewarded every time that you do the behavior. Like if you go to an ocean park or to a zoo and there's a show featuring the skills of the animals, you will notice that they are being rewarded every time that they do the tricks. So that is continuous. In fixed ratio, okay, this is a pattern of intermittent reinforcement in which reinforcement follows a set number of responses. We can transform continuous into a fixed ratio if you are rewarded, but not every after you perform the behavior. Say for example, uh, instead of receiving a cookie every time that you will do a trick, a dog trainer can give a biscuit after every 2 or every 3 times he will do the trick. So what makes it fixed ratio? By setting the number of responses into every 2, every 3, every 4, so on and so forth. Okay, so what is the basis in fixed ratio? Is it time or repetition? It's repetition. Is it fixed or variable? It's fixed. So in layman's term, fixed ratio is like fixed repetition. So the question here is, what if you're being rewarded every single repetition? Is that fixed ratio? Not exactly, because that would fall under continuous. Okay? Now, let's talk about variable ratio. In variable ratio, there's a pattern of intermittent reinforcement in which the number of responses needed for reinforcement changes. Okay, so you will still give the dog the biscuit after performing a trick, but it is not specified when are you going to give the reward. It can be after the third one, after the fourth one, after the next one, or after the fifth one. So it's randomly arranged. That is variable ratio. What is the similarity of variable ratio with fixed ratio? The basis is once again repetition. Okay, the repetition of the behavior. What is the difference? In fixed ratio, you give reward every 2 times, every 3 times. 3 repetitions, 2 repetitions, 4 repetitions, etc. But in variable ratio, the dog doesn't know in which repetition is he going to get the reward. Okay, next. Let's go to interval. When we say interval, the basis is no longer repetition, but this time it's the duration or time. In fixed interval schedule, this is a pattern of intermittent reinforcement in which reinforcement are always reinforced after a set period of time has passed. Say for example, you will receive a biscuit every 30 minutes. Okay, so regardless how many repetitions that you have done in that 30 minutes, you know that every 30 minutes you will rest, or every 30 minutes you will receive a biscuit. In variable interval, so basically the difference of interval with ratio is that it is no longer basing on the repetition, but this time on the duration. On variable interval, okay, the basis is still time, but the time period necessary for the reward is not fixed. Say for example, you are not sure when are you going to get the biscuit. Is it after 30 minutes, 15 minutes, 45 minutes? So it's similar to variable ratio, but the difference is that in variable ratio, the basis would be repetitions, while in variable interval, the basis would be time. Okay? So say for example, one example of interval would be your meal schedule. So if you follow a fixed interval, maybe you're the type of person who would strictly eat after every 6 hours. But if you follow variable interval, you don't know when's the next time that you're going to eat. So if you like to eat, you will eat. But if you would like to postpone your meal, then it's okay for you. That's variable interval. There's no predictable pattern. When are you going to take your next meal? So let me ask you, which of these would be most effective in teaching someone to learn immediately? That would be the fixed ratio. Most effective in teaching behavior immediately. So if you want an immediate output that the behavior was learned in a short amount of time, use fixed ratio. But fixed ratio does not guarantee that the behavior would still be performed in the future. Why? What is your assurance that the person will keep on doing that in the absence of the reward? That's why if you want the behavior to continue in the future, use the variable ratio or variable interval setup. Okay, so if you want the behavior to last long, use the variable schedule. However, that's true but not all the time. Here's one example. Are you supposed to give salary on a variable schedule, particularly variable interval? That's unethical. Why? If you give salary on a variable interval, it will look like this. I will give you your salary after 15 days, but after that, your next salary will be after 3 months. Then after that, after 5 days. Then in other words, the person doesn't know when he or she is going to receive the next salary. Okay, so in terms of salary, it's better to adopt a fixed schedule. Okay, more specifically, a fixed interval schedule. Okay, sometimes schedule of reinforcement may also explain what we call abnormality. So one of the questions in what we call abusive relationship is that why do people in abusive relationships stay in the relationship? One of the themes that emerges that typically abusive partners can be a good partner from time to time. So the reason why these people do not leave their abusive relationship is that they're waiting for that moment when their partner is going to apologize or to become good. Although they are very unsure when that would happen again. So that is one of the factors that maintain an abusive relationship according to psychological research. Now let's talk about another perspective in learning, which is coming from the perspective of Bandura, social learning or social cognitive theory. Okay? So the question here is that think about the think about how you first learned to tie your shoes or even to swim. Did someone just explain the way to do it? Sometimes you do not rely on explanations, but rather you observe. So when you observe, you try to imitate, you try random motions, then you get praise from your teacher or from someone who is trying to teach you that behavior. So what was not highlighted by the previous presentations or the previous theories is the power of learning from the experiences of other people or observational learning. So in social learning theory, this is the kind of learning that occurs when we model the behavior of others. Specifically, this is what we call observational learning, or learning influenced by watching others perform the behavior. Classical and operant conditioning explain many aspects of learning, but they neglect the powerful role of modeling in the learning process. Okay, so basically, the point of learning, social learning theory is that we can learn from the experiences of others. Have they been rewarded? Have they been punished? Okay, because you do not need to perform the behavior on your own for you for you to know if it's desirable or not. You can learn by simply observing others perform the said behavior. Okay, so I had a separate discussion on Bandura before, and I suggest that you view that if you want to learn more about his human agency perspective. But this time, the highlight of this lecture would be the Bobo experiment. Okay, so Bandura observed that reinforcement matters not only for the person doing the behavior, it is also for those who watch. That's why be careful. Do not perform undesirable behaviors in front of children, especially if that behavior is going to be rewarded, because they might imitate that bad behavior. Okay? So people will do things they see others are doing, especially if the model has been rewarded. Say, for example, if the adult in this image did not get any consequence, or if she has been rewarded for hitting the doll, then the child is more likely to perform that on her own. Okay, because there are no consequences, or the behavior may have been reinforced. That's why the child thinks that perhaps if I do that behavior on my own, I will also be reinforced, or maybe that behavior is good because it is being reinforced. So in the Bobo experiment, okay, there are two conditions, the control condition and the experimental condition. In the control condition, they did not watch the same film that those in the aggressive condition was watching. So the model was either there was no model, or the model was not aggressive. On the other hand, those who watch the aggressive model, okay, have two subconditions. One of them was punished for the aggression, while the other was rewarded for the aggression. So you know how the story goes. Those who were rewarded for being aggressive inspired the watchers or the viewers to be aggressive to the dolls as well. So what is the explanation behind modeling? Here are the processes behind it: attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation. So in order for you to learn by observing others, first you need to pay attention. You need to be looking at the behavior being performed. If you're not observing in the first place, then how are you supposed to learn? If you're not looking at the swimmer, then how are you supposed to swim? Next, retention. You need to remember the behavior that you just observed, or else you will have difficulty performing the behavior on your own. Then eventually, You will have to reproduce the behavior. Okay? You do it on your own. But the question is, are you motivated to do it? Motivation talks about what will be your reason to do the behavior. So basically, that's where we can see the effects of punishments and reinforcements, okay, in maintaining the behavior in the future. Okay, learning may be a product or a result of the mirror neuron system in the brain. So I introduced the concept of mirror neurons to you when we studied the structure of the nervous system. This time, let's take a look at mirror neurons once again. So, because the experience of watching someone else do something is like doing it yourself, called embodied cognition. And the existence of mirror neurons was proven among monkeys. So what they observed is this. When a monkey observes another monkey or human grab a peanut, the same neurons fire in the frontal lobe when the observing monkey actually grabs a peanut. So in other words, the firing of the same areas in the brain happens even before doing the behavior yourself. Okay, so the same areas in the brain fire or gets activated. So in other words, there is a biology about explaining the importance of observation in learning. So one one implication of deficits in mirror neuron system would be this. So let's take a look at the last bullet here. People with autism, so they may have problems in learning, but they have greater problems in social connection. Okay, they have problems in connecting or establishing attachments with others. So they say that they may have problems in mirror neurons. That's why it may explain some of the behaviors that are demonstrated by people with autism, like not establishing eye contact or avoiding eye contact or difficulty communicating, being limited in their words. Okay, so to close the discussion in learning, let's talk about smoking. Psychology of smoking from the behaviorism standpoint. So basically, when you're starting to smoke, social learning theory comes into play. You hang out with friends who smoke, and then you think that they look cool, and you begin smoking as well because you think it looks rewarding for them. And then you continue to smoke because of operant conditioning. You experience a positive reinforcement, such as being accepted or praised by your peers for smoking, and some negative reinforcement because you feel that your stress levels are reduced when you are smoking. Okay, so the outcome would be continued smoking. Now, what are the factors that discourage you from smoking? Operant conditioning, once again, obviously, if you develop health consequences or illnesses because of smoking, then you are less likely to smoke in the future. Other than that, smoking behavior is being restricted or reduced in public by making you smoke only in designated places. Okay, that's why your quote pleasurable behavior is being taken away from you. That's why it is being punished by reducing the opportunity to smoke, then it results to less smoking. Other than that, we can also see classical conditioning comes into play. We can see in the packaging of the cigarettes, there are images of lungs in poor physical health, or the smoker's lungs. And these images, sometimes they will elicit feelings of discomfort, and classical conditioning comes into play. That's why smokers are being discouraged, because they think that what if what I see on the image will also happen to me. So basically, that is it for our discussion on learning. And in this discussion, we did learn about classical conditioning, operant conditioning, mirror neurons, as well as social learning theory. And the next lesson, we are going to talk about how can we retain what we have learned through the concept or through memory.